yes, it's Baseball Things. Here's Jason A. Churchill.
Baseball Things, Jason Churchill, special edition, kicking off the prospect rankings reveal. And before we jump to number 25, and we'll go all the way through number 16 in this episode, a couple of quick notes. Number one, these rankings, or any rankings that you ever see me do, they're not related to or based on a player's chances to make the major leagues or a player's performance and stats as an amateur or as a pro. A player's grade is based here on the value of the sum of his tools, and not every tool is created equal. You know, having an 80 arm from right field is great and all, but I'd rather have a guy out there with a 50 arm and a 60 hit tool and 60 power than a guy with an 80 arm and a 40 hit tool and 50 power. Does that make sense? So it's the sum of the tools, how those tools project, and what that could look like in the major leagues in terms of a role. Is he a middle of the order hitter? Is he a top of the rotation starter? Is he a high leverage reliever? It also includes the risk and probability of all of that coming together into one package. A player's ultimate ranking is based on an organizational curve as well. So using those player grades and all that's built into it, including how difficult it is to find a similar player or a similar skill set, certainly plays into it. But again, the number 5 prospect in the Mariners organization is not equal to or relative to at all, say, the number 5 prospect in the Phillies organization. That's not how this works. I know, I would imagine that any of you actually listening to this, you guys understand this because you care about this sort of thing. You follow this sort of thing. And I imagine you've seen my rankings before 2019 here. But that does seem to get lost. Not every organization is the same. Number 5 in Seattle is different than number 5 in Philadelphia or New York or Chicago or Minnesota. And by the way, to give you an example, between a teenage high upside rookie ball arm with projectable physical frame and maybe projectable velocity versus a 21-year-old first baseman who just hit 18 home runs and batted .275 with a .340 on base percentage in the Midwest League last year, the end result of that death match is not going to go well for the first baseman if he projects as a platoon bat, even if the chances he reaches that ceiling are 5, 10, 20 times better than that rookie ball arm's chances of being a number 2 or number 3 starter. There are a lot of Steve Pearces out there, and they're dirt cheap, relatively speaking. Sometimes they're free, and when it comes to Major League Baseball, it's about balancing what you have and what you don't have and using your payroll effectively. Because as we know, Major League owners should spend more money, and that's a big topic right now in free agency. But because we know they're not going to, the general manager has a job. He has a budget. So if Jerry Dipoto has $150 million to spend, he's got to do the best he can with $150 million. And always looking for the homegrown guy and the team control years. And that's why that's been such a huge topic, because Jerry Dipoto has been attempting to get the Mariners payroll back into a range where he can manage that and actually add significant pieces to that without having to hope upon hope upon hope. So that first baseman who, is still just 21, but projects as a platoon bat or a part-time player, and he's relegated to first base or DH or maybe part-time right field, left, that's not a very valuable player, even though his performance was significantly better in this scenario than maybe that teenage kid, that 18, 19-year-old down in Arizona or the Dominican Summer League. I'd rather take my shot at the kid in the Dominican Summer League. I don't really care about the Steve Pearces of the world. I can find 100 of those. They grow on trees, not almost literally, but they're just hanging around. I mean, it's not just Bryce Harper and Manny Machado that are still free agents out there. A lot of these fringe roster guys and platoon and part-time players are still out there waiting to find jobs as well. To throw this another way, I mentioned Steve Pearce as a comp because that first baseman who's 21 and just finished a year in the Midwest League that just hit .275 with 18 bombs projects as Steve Pearce, but maybe that kid in rookie ball or short season ball or in the DSL looks a lot like I don't know, say Carlos Carrasco did 10 or 15 years ago when he was coming up. And while there's maybe a 1 or 2 or 3 or a 5% chance that kid turns into Carlos Carrasco, you have to take those shots. There are not a lot of Carlos Carrascos and Dallas Keuchels, and the ones that do exist, because that role of a number 2, number 3 type starter that carries 170 to 200 innings, that role is inherently and significantly more valuable than the Steve Pearces of the world, and it's shorter in supply. And it costs 10 to 50 times as much in trade and or payroll to acquire and to keep. The more shots you take to grab those pieces for your organization on a 25-man roster, the better chance you'll actually fill that from within. So you're not paying Wei-Yin Chen or Jeff Samardzija $20 million a year to be a number 2 starter and then watch them end up a number 3 or number 4 or number 5. And in worst case scenarios, which is more likely with arms than it is with bats, you see them spend as much time on the DL as they do on the mound. So that's number 1. Number 2, there is a rhyme and a reason for everything evaluated in these rankings. You will not hear or read anything that I haven't thought about, probably more than I should have. The tools, the players as a whole, the rankings assigned to them, all of it based on about, I'd say at bare minimum, 300 hours of conversations that generally start for me during the summer. I ask general questions such as, what's the hit tool looking like right now, to how do you project that curveball, to inquiries about differences from early in the year or previous years to what they look like now, situational baseball. Hey, have you noticed anything with this kid facing left-handed pitching? Or can this right-handed pitcher, pitch away to right-handed batters? Mechanical changes that may explain improved performance or may give them a shot to change their profile. All of that is considered. What is not considered here at all is the rankings put out by anyone else. I read Keith Loss prospect stuff every year, all year long. You've heard me talk about Keith. I learned a lot from Keith about the way to do things. I learned a lot from Keith about baseball, but I read his stuff. If I see something that Keith wrote and I'm interested in that, I either ask Keith about it or I go asking others about it. I'm not just going to go, well, Keith wrote this, so this must be true or it means this much. I need to draw my own conclusions. So that means I need to go get my own information. So I'll ask about that aspect, or I'll try and see the player myself. I also read some of what Eric Longenhagen and Kylie McDaniel do at Fangraphs, but in no manner do the rankings of those 2 entities and those 3 people who I highly respect, those are my 3 favorites, but in no manner do their rankings or anything they write or tweet about a player impact the rankings you're about to listen to or that you're ultimately going to get an opportunity to read and keep by your side during the season. Not grades, not rankings, not evaluations, nothing. I start this process 100% fresh, as if the player is brand new to me. Then I go back and read my own notes from prior to this process, and then notes from scout types and player development folks, lots of emails, lots of Twitter DMs, lots of texts. There's even a couple of voicemails because you get some old school folks that just want to talk on the phone. So I have to save some of the call recordings into my voicemail stack and then go back and listen and kind of translate that and put some notes on paper. So there's a lot that goes into it, but prior biases make it much harder to properly assign value and grades to players and their tools, as well as it fogs the probability process. If you see a player and you think something about a player and then something the player does or something a scout tells you that he feels really strongly about, you might not take that at face value if you already have this preconceived notion about the player. So you have to learn to let that go. So I leave all of that behind. So everything starts from zero. Like when I started this process, well, I started gathering notes, years ago, depending on the player. But for Justice Sheffield, I didn't start gathering notes until after the trade was made. But for players such as Kyle Lewis and Julio Rodriguez, I started collecting notes a couple of years ago. But when I started this process, again, 100% from scratch, I basically pretended I didn't have any old notes. So I went back and thought, okay, here's what I got this year. Here's what he was last year. And I almost don't even think about the name. I just think, okay, this is a kid who's 6'3", 180. Scout says this. I saw this. This is his track record. This is his projected ceiling that I had for him last year. I start from zero and I mold kind of a new. That's one of the reasons why you're going to go back and you can compare last year's to this year. And sometimes it'll look like it's a different player. And you know what? That's because sometimes it is a different player. But sometimes that's just how much better the player got, how much worse the player got, how much the projection changed, or how different the information that I was able to gather ended up being. But most of the time, it's about the player actually just simply changing probability, taking away some risk, adding risk because of injury with Kyle Lewis, for example, whatever it might be. So that's kind of how I do this. I think you have to start from zero, because if you have a preconceived notion about a player, Evan White, for example, right now the preconceived notion going into next year might be, well, he doesn't project to hit for power like a traditional first baseman. Well, if I go into next year's process thinking that, and I look at some of the notes, and let's say Evan White hits 30 bombs in Double-A this year, well, that would answer production-wise, that would answer a lot of those questions, would it not? But why did he hit those 30 home runs? So I'm not just going to take that at face value. I'm going to say, okay, it's fact. He hit 30 bombs. Maybe he also had 30 doubles and slugged over 500, played 120 games, whatever it is. I'm also going to try to find ways to disprove that the 30 home runs actually means he answered those questions. And if I can, then I'm going to keep digging. I'm going to keep digging for more, because it almost turns into like a detective case. I need to find enough information to prove to me that that's actually what's going on here, that he hit 30 home runs and it was kind of just one of those things like Brandon Wood. Yeah, but he struck out 150 times. Or yeah, but he hit 230 and last year he hit for average. Whatever that might be. Or yeah, but that swing change just isn't going to work with big league pitching. I'm looking for a way to fail Evan White on his 30 home runs in that scenario. Does that make sense? And if I can't find it, then I'm feeling really good about that 30 home runs. And I'm feeling really good about the scout that says, boy, he's really found a way to hit for power to center field and right center field. That tells me that it's real. So there are really no stones unturned here. I flip everything over. I try to disprove everything. I leave all the preconceived notions behind. And if they show up again, the same as they did a year ago, I try to disprove them. I try to prove them again. I try to prove them 2 and 3 times. I'll have conversations with scouts and say, you know what? I just flat out think you're wrong. Tell me why I'm actually crazy. And every once in a while, one of them will say, you know what? I don't think you're crazy. I just think we see 2 different things. But I don't think you're nuts. And I don't think there's any chance that there's no chance that you're right. We just happen to believe different things at this particular point. So the fact that I put that time in, and I do flip over every stone, and I try to cover every single one of the bases. That's one of the reasons why I love doing this. That's one of the reasons why I'm really confident that these players are ranked correctly. That's one of the reasons why I feel the tools grades and the overall future value, the OFP for these players, is about as accurate as one human being can possibly get them. If I didn't feel that way, I wouldn't put these out there. I would just be like, well, this is what I think, but I would just be one of those Twitter guys. So I've loved doing this for a long time. I feel like every year, this is not about accuracy, by the way, in rankings and grades, but you have to feel good about where those rankings and those grades are right now. Like, if you think he's going to be something, but he's not something, well, how much of that is actual projection? If I'm giving Jarred Kelenic, let's say a 65 power grade, well, how much of that is present and how much of that is projection, and how much do I believe in that? So you do have to believe, and you're not going to project something and say, well, if everything is just perfect and he adds 20 pounds and he changes his swing, that's going too far. If that's what you would have to do to convince yourself that a guy like Jarred Kelenic, or any player for that matter, has a 65 power grade, well, maybe he doesn't have a 65 power grade. Maybe that's his massive, ceiling power grade, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense to project that at this particular point. Now, if he goes and changes some things that changes your mind and gives you a little more confidence that maybe he's a 60 or a 65 power grade, then you might have the confidence to project that, hey, in the next 3 years, he's probably going to have a 65 power grade. So you really have to be convinced of it. And I think maybe the most important thing that I've done here is ask myself, if I was reading this and I was a baseball scout or a general manager, a scouting director, amateur or pro, or some area scout or something, if I was reading this, is it reasonable, and what are the chances that it's correct? And that's why I feel as confident in this set of rankings as I do any other. I think just about every year or so, I come up with another way to kind of check myself on these, because look, some of this is in the eye of the beholder. It's very true. There's no exact science here. But I've put in the time. I hope you like it. By the way, I got one more thing that I wanted to make sure I got to before I actually move on to the rankings themselves. And again, tonight we're going to do numbers 25 all the way down through number 16. But there is a third thing I want to talk about. The actual rankings, both player specific and the organizational rankings that I do here. By the way, I don't do organizational rankings. I don't do those, but you're undoubtedly seeing those all over the internet right now, whether it's Keith Law or MLB or Baseball America or somebody from Bleacher Report or the Fangraphs guys. They really don't mean a whole lot. And they certainly don't mean what that number next to their name actually means. Like if you see the Mariners organization ranked, 20th by some outlet, 24th by another, 17th by another, if, say, Jared Kelenic is ranked 67th by somebody, 55th by somebody else, 33rd by somebody else, it doesn't really mean, that number doesn't really mean anything. Even if one of them is correct, that number actually means 0. That just tells you where that particular player stands with everybody else. Again, we're assuming in this scenario that one of these sets of rankings is correct. So one thing to kind of get through here, first of all, it's on a curve. Okay, so I'll use Kelenic again. Assuming a specific ranking is correct, Jared Kelenic being the 55th best prospect in baseball. I'm just making that up. I don't know. I don't think I've seen. I think I saw Keith Law's rankings, and Kelenic I think was in the 50s or 60s, but let's just say he was 55th, and I'm suggesting that that ranking is correct. All that means is 54 prospects are better bets to be better MLB players at that particular time. Being ranked 55 one year is not the same as being ranked 55 in any other year, just like the organizational rankings I spoke of, and just like players within organizational ranking. Kelenic being number 2 in the Mariners organization doesn't mean he's equal to or better or the same as other clubs' number 2 prospects. That's not the way it works. But being ranked 55 one year, not the same as being ranked 55 in any other season. And the varying value of that is not something we have a lot of quantitative data on. As an industry, it's far too eye of the beholder, even in 2019. And even though it's less that way than it was 10 years ago, that ranking is not indicative of anything but where that player is now. Again, we're assuming this analyst is 100% correct. Player profiles change so much. I cannot begin to explain how big of a deal this is to understand these days. Player development advancements make the potential variance in future value greater for prospects in a positive direction than ever before. But rather than this making it easier to project players for teams and analysts alike, clubs are more willing to take risk on certain player types, making it even more difficult, in a vacuum at least, to evaluate the player's long-term future, especially if you're not somebody who works for the team. The team's going to have a better idea because they have more information. For somebody such as myself, I'm going to get limited looks at him. I don't know if he's in the process of making a change to his swing or adding a changeup. I don't know those things, but the Mariners, it goes the same thing for teams. The Mariners being ranked number 20, assuming that's 100% correct for sake of this conversation here, means at this time, their collection of talent projects better and more safely than only 10 other clubs in Major League Baseball. This can change so quickly, even without new players being added to the system, because player profiles change. Here's one good example. Go check and see. It doesn't matter who you look at. Go check and see how the Los Angeles Angels ranked heading into the 2009 season. I don't even know the answer to that question because I didn't look it up. But the Angels always strike me as the perfect example here. Heading into 2009, where did the Angels rank? They drafted Mike Trout. Then go look at where they ranked after Trout started lighting up minor league pitchers and skating through the minors. At draft time, Trout was an upside play, a kid with tools. Nobody trusted the tools enough to take him top 20, and I think he ended up going 24. A year and a half later, he's the best prospect in baseball, and the Angels' ranking shot up as a result. They didn't have a whole lot else going for him. Because if that were true, they'd be a better team than they were. They won 98 games one year. DePota was down there. They haven't really done much the rest of the time that Trout's been there. So in a year and a half, the Angels ranking skyrocketed because Trout ultimately ended up being the best prospect in baseball, and now he's the best player in baseball. Furthermore, an organizational prospect ranking does not indicate future success or lack thereof. I wrote about that about 2 or 3 months ago and offered multiple examples of clubs ranking very high, like the Padres, for example, and then not winning anything within 5 to 7 years after that. And clubs such as the Nationals not ranking very high at all, winning every single year. Future Major League Baseball club success is not about prospect ranking and never has been, not even a little bit. And I think it's probably important to note the reason I don't do organizational rankings is because I don't have the time to see other organizations nor track down enough info on them from those who have to properly rank them. That takes a lot of time. The process is so extensive. And I do it for the Mariners because I love it, but doing it for 30 clubs is not plausible for me. And it's really not plausible for a whole lot of people, but those that do it do a fairly good job at it. But even if I did have the time, I would pass at this point because it seems like clickbait more than anything right now. There's no value to them beyond the entertainment and ensuing discussions. If a team is ranked 22nd or 26th or 11th or 4th, it's not like, okay, cool, they're ranked in the top 10, so that means within 3 years they have a chance to win 90 or 95 games. That's just not what it means. There's no line we can draw from these rankings that actually mean anything. It's a very general idea of where the organizational talent actually is. And you know what? I look at the Mariners, who probably rank, I mean, for me, my best guess would be between like 15 and 18. I saw that Keith Law had him at 20, was it 24, I believe. But they've come so far. The difference between 30 and 24 is only 6 spots, but the difference between where the Mariners organization was farm system wise a year ago versus where it is now is so dramatic that you could have told me they were ranked 10th and I'd have been like, yeah, okay, that's a tad surprising, but okay, I get it. They've added so much talent, and that's just how bad they were. So you can only go as high as 1, and you can only go as low as 30. So those numbers don't actually represent anything. Those numbers don't represent grades. That ranking 24 does not represent a grade. That's not a D- farm system. That's not an F farm system. The number one farm system in baseball usually is an A or an A+, but again, it changes from year to year, and if you're grading on the curve, 1 through 30 is the best way to do it. You can't just go A, A-, B, B+. That's just not the way it works. And talent and organizations and farm system and values and roles, they change so much from even year to year that there's really no better system to do it. And again, it's really just for entertainment purposes. People like to see rankings. They like to see lists. They like to make their own rankings and make their own lists. So that's why these things will always be made, and they'll be fun to talk about sometimes. They'll be annoying to talk about other times. But that's why I don't do it. And that's why, in my opinion, organizational rankings aren't valuable in determining how good your baseball team either could be in a few years, will be, won't be, can't be. It just doesn't resonate at all. I mean, we've just seen too many clubs that just have never really ranked high have success. And it's not just the Yankees and the Nationals and the Dodgers who also have money. Look around and see how some of these teams have succeeded. It hasn't been because of their farm systems, even when the farm systems ranked high. They didn't trade for the guys that made the difference. It's usually teams between 10 and 20 that are ultimately end up winning the World Series in 4 years. So there's no correlation. There's no straight line to draw. It's very jagged. There's so many ways to acquire players. Most winning players are actually acquired via trade or free agency of some kind, and that includes the international free agent market. The draft is the only way where trading or signing isn't the thing. You drafted the player because you had an assigned spot in the draft. There's just too many ways to kind of tear apart those rankings and what they actually mean. But again, they're entertaining, they're fun, and a lot of fun for you guys as Mariner fans. The Mariners organization is significantly in better shape than they were even 6 months ago when the draft hit, let alone a year ago or 2 years ago or 4 years ago. And I think I've explained some of the differences from my perspective on where the Mariners are right now heading into the 2019 season versus where the Mariners were in about 2012, which is coming into the years where the Mariners had drafted Hultzen and Taijuan Walker and James Paxton and Dustin Ackley, and Kyle Seager surprised us as a third-round pick. Where the farm system was and where the rebuild was because of the differences in the way the two clubs went about the rebuild and the positions that Jack Sorensic was in heading into the 09 season and the position Jerry DiPoto is in heading into the 2019 season. You really just can't paint. It's just not the same at all. Thank you for listening. That'll do it for this edition of Baseball Things. Thank you to Baseball for Existing. Thank you, Steve Sandmeyer. Thanks to all of you Thingers for sticking with me. It's prospect time. Churchill out.
Look, talent comes everywhere, but having something to say and a way to say it so people listen to it, that's a whole other bag. And unless you get out there and you try to do it, you'll never know. That's just the truth. And there's one reason we're supposed to be here is to say something so people want to hear it. So you got to grab it. And you don't apologize. You don't worry about why they're listening or how long they're going to be listening for. You just tell them what you want to say.